Welcome everyone to this webinar, Climate Change and Farmworker Communities. This webinar is part of a project of the Health Resources and Services Administration. Before we begin, I do want to introduce our interpreters, Javi and Kayla, who will just share a little bit of information about the interpretation that's available during today's webinar. Javi and Kayla, please share.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Kayla, seré una de las intérpretes el día de hoy con Javi.
Good morning, my name is Javi. I'll be one of the interpreters today with my colleague Kayla.
Esta serie de eventos será interpretada en inglés y español.
This event will be interpreted into English and Spanish.
Antes de guiarles a acceder a la función de interpretación, queremos repasar algunas pautas de justicia del lenguaje.
Before walking you through accessing the interpretation feature, we want to go over a few language justice guidelines.
Les pedimos a todos que hablen a un paso moderado, especialmente cuando están presentando contenido de números, direcciones, abreviaciones y o sustantivos propios o cuando estén leyendo, ya que tendemos a hablar más rápido cuando leemos. Si necesitamos que hablen más despacio, haremos esta seña. Compartiremos estos símbolos en el chat, los pondré ahora, o el anfitrión le interrumpirá para pedirle que hable más despacio.
Please speak at a moderate pace, especially for presenters when stating numbers, addresses, acronyms, and or proper nouns, or when reading aloud, as we tend to speak a little faster when reading. If we need you to slow down, we will make this sign on camera and share these symbols in the chat. Or the host may kindly interrupt you to slow down.
Si mencionan términos complejos o siglas, les pedimos que por favor las deletreen o expliquen.
If you do mention complex terms and acronyms, please spell them out or explain them.
Tomen pausas y respiren al hablar. Esto nos dará tiempo para capturar y terminar de interpretar lo que se ha dicho.
Take pauses and breaths while speaking. This will give us time to capture and render everything being shared.
Finalmente, cuando interpretamos al español, se darán cuenta que usamos E o X en vez del uso tradicional A o O, al final de palabras que se refieren a personas. Esto no es un error, sino una práctica intencional para incluir géneros no binarios. La justicia del lenguaje también incluye justicia de género.
Finally, when we interpret into Spanish, you will notice that we use E or X at the end of words referring to people instead of the traditional gendered A-O endings. This is not a mistake. It is an intentional practice to include non-binary genders. Language justice also includes gender justice.
La función de interpretación ya está activada. Si usted está en su computadora, verá aparecer un globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de la ventana de Zoom. Si está en su teléfono, va a haber 3 puntos en la parte de abajo de su pantalla. Haga clic aquí, luego haga clic en Interpretación de idiomas y seleccione el idioma que habla. Si usted no es bilingüe en inglés y español, debe escoger un canal de idioma.
The interpretation feature is now activated. If you're on a computer, you will see a globe at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you're on your phone, you will see 3 dots at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Click on these and select the language you speak. If you're not bilingual in both English and Spanish, you must select a language channel.
Gracias. Le pasamos la palabra a los anfitriones. Ahora podemos comenzar a usar la función de interpretación.
Thank you. We will now pass it over to the host. We may now begin to use the interpretation feature.
Thank you, Javi and Kayla, for joining us today. And thank you, all of you, for joining us on this webinar today. So before we begin with the content, I just want to quickly talk about Farmworker Justice. For those of you who may not be familiar, Farmworker Justice is a national organization. We are based in Washington, D.C., and we seek to empower farm workers and their families to improve their living and working conditions, immigration status, health, occupational safety, and access to justice. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar is part of a project supported by the Health Resources and Services Administration. The content of this webinar is the responsibility of Farmworker Justice and does not necessarily represent the official views of, nor an endorsement by HRSA, the Department of Health and Human Services, or the United States government. I am going to turn over the webinar to my colleagues who will introduce themselves and will be presenting the rest of the webinar. We certainly, again, thank you for joining us. We will have time at the end for question and answer, but in the meantime, if you do have any questions or comments as we go through the presentation, please do not hesitate to put them into the chat. Thank you again, and I'm going to turn it over to Nina and Mayra.
Thank you, Alexis. I'm Nina. I'm a project director at Farmworker Justice. I'm joined by my colleague, Mayra, who I will let introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mayra Reiter. I work as project director for Occupational Health and Justice and Safety with Farmworker Justice.
Thanks. So today on our webinar, we will be covering some of the overall impacts of climate change on farm worker communities, some of the health challenges of farm workers and barriers to care. And then we'll go into some of the specific environmental risks for farm workers. So these topics include heat stress, pesticide exposure, water contamination. We'll talk about some recommendations and best practices. We'll present a few resources, and then we'll have a little time at the end for questions. Next slide, please. So I want to start with just a brief definition of climate change. Climate change refers to longer-term shifts in average temperature and weather patterns, which have been shown to impact our environment and our health. So this graphic is from the Centers for Disease Control. There's a lot going on in the slide, but it essentially shows how climate change is linked to human health. Some of the impacts we see as a result of changing climate conditions and rising temperatures can include changes in our water quality, our food supply, increases in air pollution, and environmental degradation from extreme weather events such as hurricanes, droughts, and floods, all of which are becoming more severe and happening more often. Climate change has also been linked to more extreme heat events. When there's increased heat and dry conditions, this can lead to intense fire seasons and increase the risk for wildfires. And that outer circle of the graphic shows the range of health issues that can arise as a result of these extreme weather events. So that includes respiratory and cardiovascular disease, physical injuries and deaths, mental health concerns, and changes in both the prevalence and geographical distribution of infectious diseases. Next slide, please. So farm workers often feel the impacts of climate threats most directly because they work outside, often in places that are more prone to weather extremes, and they're exposed to environmental hazards for longer periods of time. Some of the health impacts we're seeing in farm worker communities are an increase in heat-related illnesses, which have been linked to acute and chronic kidney disease. Poor air quality and exposure to pesticides can also put farm workers at higher risk for respiratory issues and acute and chronic illnesses. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the webinar. And extreme weather events can also drive the displacement of farm workers from their homes and places of work. So this can create a lot of financial hardship and stress. So in addition to the physical injuries, there's also the impact to mental health. Next slide, please. So there are a number of factors that make farm workers more vulnerable to the impacts of climate threats. On this slide are just a few examples. Number one is occupational health risks. So when we talk about farm worker health, it's important to note that agricultural work is very dangerous, and the agricultural industry in the United States has historically been treated differently than other industries. So farm workers are excluded from many basic labor protections and safety regulations, and the laws that do exist aren't always consistently enforced. Many farm workers are also dependent on their employer for meeting some of their basic needs like housing and transportation, so it can leave them vulnerable to exploitation. This is particularly true for migrant farm workers who are physically distant from their family networks. They work long hours and live on farms without social support. So again, that can be very isolating and have negative impacts on mental health. And as a result of these structural factors, these living and working conditions, farm workers tend to experience worse health outcomes compared to the general population. And so the threats from climate change are often just deepening existing health disparities. Next slide. So despite the clear need for healthcare and support services for farm workers, they face several barriers to actually accessing that healthcare. One big barrier is cost. Recent data from the National Agricultural Worker Survey, which is issued by the Department of Labor, showed that 20% of farm worker families had an income below the federal poverty level, and only about half of farm workers in the United States reported having health insurance. Historically, farm workers' use of public assistance programs has been low, especially for those who are undocumented. They can be reluctant to apply for benefits, even if they are eligible, because they're concerned about how it might affect their immigration status or that of their family members. Many migrant and seasonal farm workers also face obstacles to healthcare because of language barriers. The percentage of workers who are fluent in English is low, and about 29% of workers share that they don't speak any English at all. So there aren't enough culturally appropriate resources and services offered in languages that farm workers speak, whether that's Spanish or other indigenous languages. And these resources are often not available in the formats that are most accessible to farm workers. Farm workers also don't often get sick leave, so they can struggle to get the time they need off from work to access health services, and they may lack reliable transportation options to get to a health center. And then, of course, there are other factors like discrimination and just a lack of familiarity or trust in the US healthcare system, which can prevent farm workers from accessing care. Next slide, please. So the health outcomes we see in farm worker communities are a direct result of this interplay between the environmental stressors, social determinants of health, and the gaps in our existing health and legal and social infrastructure, all of which leaves farm workers increasingly vulnerable to climate threats. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Mayra to talk about some of the specific risks facing farm workers.
Thank you, Nina. So as Nina said, I will talk a little bit about the environmental impacts and the risks that farm workers are facing due to the climate crisis. So one of the things that have captured the most attention recently because of the extreme weather events we're seeing, which include more frequent record heat waves, is the problem of heat stress among farm workers. And heat stress, as you probably know, is what happens when the body is exposed to environmental heat and also from the heat that's generated when people are doing very physical work. And the body begins to lose the ability to cool itself, and this can lead to heat-related illness. And we know from surveys that have been done that farm workers experience very high rates of heat stress and heat-related illnesses. And the UFW, United Farm Workers, did a survey about 2 years ago in which they found that 69% of farm workers reported having experienced symptoms of heat illness in their work. And there are many health impacts stemming from the exposure to hazardous levels of heat. That includes greater rates of work injuries. There have been studies that have shown that workers' compensation claims rise in the wake of heat waves. And this is partly because heat affects a person's ability to think clearly, to be alert. It affects people's dexterity, and this is dangerous when people are doing dangerous work, and agricultural work is dangerous work. Heat stress can also lead to acute kidney injury and to kidney disease. And this is something that has been documented in a few studies that have been done here in the United States, and also studies that have been done in Central America. And the reason is because the high levels of heat to which farm workers are exposed leads to high levels of dehydration. And this is very dangerous for kidney health. And farm workers are disproportionately affected by the effects of heat stress. Farm workers comprise 1.4% of all employed workers in the United States, but they represent about 15% of all deaths due to heat in occupational settings. And these risks, which are already high, are increasing. It's expected that by mid-century, our planet will have warmed about 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. And scientists have done certain estimates of how this is going to affect the exposure of outdoor workers to heat. And the latest estimates that we have is that by mid-century, the number of unsafe working days experienced by the average farm worker is going to increase from 21 days to 39 days. And there are parts of the United States where these baseline numbers are already being exceeded in the area around Fresno, California, and in parts of Florida, where they get very severe heat waves. We are seeing numbers like these or even worse. Despite these high risks that are well documented, very few states in the US have any kind of heat standard to protect outdoor workers. Currently, only 4 states have rules regarding heat exposure in the workplace. Those are California, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. Maryland is in the process of developing a standard, but that standard has not been issued as of this date. And in addition to that, there is no federal standard. This means that most outdoor workers in the country, including farm workers, don't have specific legal protections to safeguard them from hazardous heat in the workplace. The Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, began a rulemaking process in 2021 to establish a heat standard. But the length of time it takes OSHA to issue a standard is typically between 7 and 8 years. And right now we are in a climate emergency. So we're hoping that it won't take OSHA 7 years to issue this standard because the protections are needed right now. And heat doesn't just impact farm workers in relation to heat stress. Pesticide exposures are made worse by high temperatures. It's expected that as the planet continues to warm, the range of many pests is going to increase. And this is going to lead to increased pesticide use, exposing many more farm workers. At the same time, the higher temperatures can increase the rate at which pesticides evaporate into the air. And this can lead to higher pesticide concentrations in the air and more exposure among those who have to work around these chemicals. The high temperatures also increase the rate at which some pesticides transform into more toxic compounds. And this increases the risk that any exposure is going to lead to worse outcomes than it would in the absence of this additional problem of the higher heat. Heat can also affect the performance of certain personal protective equipment, or PPE, It has been demonstrated in some studies that higher temperatures can affect how well PPE, such as gloves, can protect people from being exposed to pesticides. And if the equipment is not performing as it should, it means that people are being exposed to higher doses of chemicals. Another urgent problem that we're seeing more and more because of climate change is how floods and droughts are affecting people's access to affordable clean water. And the problem of clean water access in rural areas isn't new. For a long time, water systems in low-income and rural communities have been struggling to meet drinking water standards. But this problem has been made much worse because of the effects of climate change. Floods can contaminate water supplies, and this is something we see wherever massive floods occur, like with Hurricane Ian recently in Florida, and in many other places where those flood waters bring all sorts of contaminants into water sources that are difficult to filter out of the water and that can leave systems contaminated for a long period of time. And droughts also affect the availability and the quality of water sources. We are seeing that in California over the last few years, thousands of rural wells have gone dry, leaving people who rely on those sources of water scrambling to find alternative sources. And this is something that is expected fully to continue worsening because the mega droughts in the West are not expected to abate anytime soon. And we're seeing droughts happening more and more in other areas of the country. In addition to the climate effects, there are also many structural barriers that are making clean water access harder for rural communities. And one of them is that there has been chronic underinvestment in water infrastructure in rural areas. And this is worsened because in the US, typically water systems have to rely on a self-funding model. That means that they have to be able to pay for their operations and their maintenance out of the fees that their customers pay. But this is not a sustainable model for poor communities, where there simply isn't the money to be able to charge high fees and maintain these systems. In addition, government grant funding is often earmarked for construction and not so much for operations and maintenance. And these are costs that increase as water systems age, and they have to spend more and more money on operations and on being able to maintain their infrastructure. Government funding often has cost sharing requirements as well, in which the entities that are receiving the funding are supposed to cover some of the costs. And these are multi-million-dollar projects when we're talking about water infrastructure. So it's very difficult for poor communities to be able to fund any kind of water project. And they end up being dependent on their state providing the funding so that they can meet that cost sharing requirement. And this often doesn't happen. Another problem is that unincorporated areas are at a disadvantage when it comes to accessing government funding. One of the biggest examples of unincorporated areas that are having water problems is the Colonias area near the border between Texas and Mexico. And this is an area where there is endemic poverty, many problems with access to clean water, but unincorporated areas like that don't have the political influence and the political access to be able to get the funds that they need to solve these water problems. And to give you an example of a very recent law that places structural barriers in front of communities, the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed in 2021 included $510 million over 5 years for drinking water grants for disadvantaged communities. But even this law, even though those funds are meant for disadvantaged communities, has a cost share requirement of 45%. And this is going to present a significant barrier to many communities who could benefit from those funds. So based on these issues that I have laid out, which we have discussed with many of our community partners, and conversations we had around the time of an Environmental Justice Symposium that we hosted in May, we have identified some of the best practices that have been successful for farm worker organizations and community organizations to help address some of the issues that I have been talking about today. And one of these is collaboration between diverse organizations. For example, farm worker organizations with community organizations, partnering with health centers, partnering with academic institutions, which allows these different organizations to take advantage of the networks and the strengths that they each have. And this enables them to better cover the needs that are in farm worker communities. And one of those types of partnerships is community-based participatory research. And I can give you an example of that is well known. And that is the Girasoles project, which was made in partnership between Emory University and the Farm Worker Association of Florida, when these two organizations came together to conduct a study of biomarkers of heat stress in farm worker communities. And it's a study that has been cited extensively, and it has provided great evidence of the impacts of heat stress on kidney health among farm workers. And it's a very important model of how a farm worker organization and an academic institution can come together and leverage the research funding and the expertise of the scientific researchers and the community access and that trust by the community that farm worker organizations enjoy. Another practice that has been successful is that of creating policy briefs. And these are policy summaries that explain the policy priorities and solutions devised by the communities to policymakers in everyday language that they can understand. Because many times the people who are making the policy don't have the expertise on the issues that they are regulating. And this is the way that communities and organizations can put their own solutions and their own priorities front and center. And they have been proven to be a very good advocacy tool. Another best practice that became quite popular during the COVID pandemic is the use of radionovelas and public service announcements. The radionovelas are short dramatized stories, and they have been delivered on radio stations broadcasting in Spanish. They have been released on social media and through other media. And this is a good way to get out messages to the community and to conduct advocacy with the community and outreach. And it's a culturally and linguistically appropriate tool to get out health messages. And also employing community health workers, which farm worker organizations and community health centers have done with a lot of success. These are lay health educators who come from the communities in which they work. So that means that they enjoy the trust of the community, and they conduct outreach on different health issues. And not only are they educating the community, but they are helping bring the community together. In addition to that, many organizations have had a great deal of success with social media campaigns. And this has been useful not just to get health messages out to farm workers and instructing people about emergency preparedness, but it has also been good to raise the awareness of the wider community about the problems that farm workers are facing. And during the pandemic, many people became aware for the first time of how essential farm workers are. And farm worker organizations like Farmworker Justice were able not only to make people aware of how COVID was affecting farm workers, but also how they were being affected by heat stress, by wildfires, by many of those climate impacts that we're talking about today. And as a result of that, we saw an increase in awareness in the community and an increase in support for the cause of helping farm workers address these crises. And another best practice is that of including farm worker testimonies, whether it's in social media campaigns, in advocacy with policymakers, when developing tools for different kinds of media. It's good to include those voices of the farm workers, because it's one thing for policymakers and others to hear from organizations like us about what's happening to farm workers, but it's much more effective for them to hear from the farm workers themselves about the effects that they are facing, because the impacts are very stark and they are getting more and more acute as the climate crisis progresses. And these are issues that require urgency, and hearing from the farm workers, it creates that sense of urgency to address these issues. And based on these health issues and the conversations that we have had with community partners, we have developed a set of policy recommendations for addressing the health impacts and issues such as heat stress, pesticide exposure, and also the access to clean water that we have been discussing today. And one of those policy solutions that we need is to increase funding for health centers. Health centers have a role to play when it comes to educating the community about emergency preparedness, disaster aid, and also providing mental health services. But they don't just need funding for providing those services to the community. They need funding to ensure that they are able to maintain the continuity of their services when they are faced with a climate impact, such as extreme weather and natural disasters. And also, policymakers need to involve community organizations in all aspects of planning for emergencies. This includes emergency preparedness, response, and recovery, because no one knows the needs of those communities, that no one knows them better than the communities themselves. And also, it's important that they make sure that emergency information is communicated in the appropriate languages. We have heard stories about farm worker communities having difficulty accessing information about evacuation orders, about other important information that they should have known prior to a natural disaster, because those alerts are not always being communicated in Spanish, or they are not being communicated through media that the community has access to. So that information that needs to be communicated includes alerts, evacuation information, and it needs to be done through media and through organizations that can reach even those communities that are most remote and hardest to reach, such as workers who are living in labor camps, which have been left behind in previous emergencies because they are not getting the information and they are not getting the means to protect themselves and to be able to evacuate in the face of a natural disaster. We also need to ensure that all people, regardless of immigration status, feel comfortable accessing emergency shelter and other services, so that people are not putting themselves in danger out of fear that their immigration status is going to be a barrier to them being able to access government services. Also, there's a need for greater funding for farm worker organizations and other community groups for emergency preparedness. The government, of course, has a big role to play, but these organizations have access to the community. They provide a lot of services to communities that are underserved by government agencies, and these efforts need to be funded. Right now in Florida, after Hurricane Ian, we have heard stories of farm worker communities that were still flooded a week after the storm. And they hadn't seen state agencies, they hadn't seen federal agencies combined to offer help. But organizations such as the Farmworker Association of Florida and other partners were down there trying to access those communities and provide them help. And that requires funding. There's also a need for more response and recovery resources for underserved rural areas, and that includes farm worker communities. And concerning heat, as I mentioned before, there's a need for a federal heat standard. There is a patchwork of regulations right now that leaves most workers exposed to heat stress without any specific legal protections. And we need workers to be able to have paid cool-down breaks and a right to shade when temperatures get too high, because these things are very important to be able to protect their health. There's also training in heat stress prevention and response that needs to be in languages that workers understand. And this needs to be something that's required in every workplace. And we need agencies to also start increasing the number of unannounced workplace inspections, because the system currently relies too much on workers being able to make complaints to OSHA or to other agencies. But many of these workers are vulnerable to losing their jobs if they make a complaint against their employer. And they are vulnerable to employer retaliation in other ways. So agencies need to be more assertive and need to increase the level of enforcement to make sure that what rules exist are actually being complied with by agricultural employers. And we also want there to be more increased public outreach regarding heat stress. We all know that heat is harmful, but we need to ensure that information, not just about the harms of heat, but on how to respond in case of heat illness, is also communicated to farm workers and to other workers who are at greatest risk. In order to reduce pesticide exposure, we are recommending that EPA incentivize regenerative farming and integrated pest management. The Environmental Protection Agency has done a very good job of promoting this in other settings, such as in schools, but they haven't promoted integrated pest management in agriculture very much. And this is where the greatest exposures are happening. There should also be increased funding for pesticide safety training for farm workers. And in addition to that, we need bilingual pesticide labels on the products that farm workers are using, because currently the vast majority of those products are not required to have Spanish information, even though for 2/3 of the farm workers in this country, Spanish is their main language. So there are people being exposed to chemicals when they don't fully understand what they are being exposed to and what the health effects are or how to protect themselves. There's also a need for increased biomonitoring to assess farm worker exposures to pesticides and more funding for pesticide poisoning surveillance. Right now, only 10 states are participating in a federal surveillance program. It's called the CESAR program, and there's not nearly enough funding to expand the program to the rest of the country. So many cases of pesticide poisoning are not being reported and are not being investigated. To increase access to clean and affordable water, we need increased water quality testing in communities that don't have municipal water treatment. And that includes rural private water wells, which are typically not provided funding because they are private systems, but they need that funding to be able to ensure that they are complying with clean water laws and that communities are not being put at risk. It's also important to fund programs to provide home filtration systems in rural communities, because clean water access is something that sometimes takes years to accomplish when a community has been faced with barriers to accessing clean water. And while these problems are being addressed, we need immediate solutions that can help those families who are being put at risk so that they don't have to wait years until new systems are built so that they can have clean and safe water in their homes. And also more funding for rural water systems, including funds for operations and maintenance, not just for construction, because as these systems age, their costs are going up, but in poor communities, there's not really the money to keep these systems functioning at a level that won't endanger the communities. And we are also recommending more funding for drilling and maintenance of wells in low-income rural areas, and that the federal government, to the extent possible, eliminate the matching fund requirements for low-income communities, because this, as we mentioned earlier, is a significant barrier to communities being able to access clean water. Communities also need technical assistance with water projects, and also farm workers need financial assistance when their jobs have been affected by droughts. And it's a phenomenon that we're seeing more and more in places like California, where a years-long drought is leaving farm workers not just out of access to clean water, but also out of jobs. And there's an important aspect that is often overlooked when it comes to water access, and it's the inspection of workplaces to ensure that farm workers have access to clean drinking water and sanitary facilities at work, because something as basic as clean drinking water or hand washing facilities are not always available to them in the places where they work, even though it's required by federal regulations. And of course, there are many other policies that are necessary to address the climate impacts that we have been talking about today. But these are some of the policy recommendations that we have identified based on the needs that we and our partners are seeing in relation to the issues that we have talked about regarding health, heat stress, pesticide exposure, and water access. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Nina.
Thanks, Mayra. So we just wanted to share some additional resources if you're interested to learn more. Farmworker Justice developed an issue brief that examines some of the current legislation and programs relevant to the impacts of climate change, including the topics that we discussed today. We also have a report summarizing some of the recommendations that came out of our Environmental Justice Symposium, which we held earlier this year. And then a couple more resources that we developed with partners at Vermont Law School and the Migrant Clinicians Network about the enforcement of pesticide regulations, and a clinician's guide to heat-related illness. Next slide. So with our remaining time, we'd like to open the floor for any questions that you might have. You can just go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll take as many as we can. And if we're not able to get to your question, we'll make sure to follow up after the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayra and Nina. And I actually am going to kick us off with a question, which is, you mentioned the Environmental Justice Symposium, and I know that many of these recommendations and the information came out of presentations and the discussions during that symposium. Can you just share with everyone who may not be familiar a little bit more about that symposium, what it was, and you have the links to the report, but I also know that we have some of the presentations available. So if you can just share a little bit more information about that, that would be fantastic.
Sure, Alexis. So the Environmental Justice Symposium was a 2-day symposium that we held in May, really to sort of showcase why it's important to focus on climate change and its impacts to farm worker communities. We know they're particularly at risk and they often don't get any resources or attention. So we spent the first day with kind of an overview of the impacts to climate to farm worker communities, and we talked about some of the policy recommendations, some of the gaps that exist in systems. And the second day was really sort of getting everyone together to talk about what they're seeing in communities. So we had participants from the legal field, academia, community organizations, and health centers to sort of identify exactly how climate change is impacting their communities and what we can do to address those concerns. And we can, and as I mentioned, we have a link to the symposium report on our website, as well as kind of a summary of recommendations that came out of that symposium.
Thank you so much, Mayra. I don't know if there's anything you would like to add about the symposium.
Well, the symposium was really just a starting point for some of the work that we are doing now on heat stress and other climate issues. This is something that is becoming more and more urgent, and we don't see the responses that we need from the private sector, sometimes from government and others, and we all have a role to play on this. So farm worker justice is going to be making this a priority. And if you want to have more information about the activities that we're doing, you can always follow us on social media, take a look at our website. As Nina says, we have the information there about not just the symposium, but the reports and other publications that we have that talk more about climate change issues and how they affect farm workers.
Thank you, Mayra and Nina, for that information. And I put in the chat a link to the recorded presentation. So we encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and access those when you have time. And if you do have any questions, again, you can either type them in the chat in Spanish or English, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. And while we are waiting on that, just one more question, and I know this may be challenging, but how, if you had to, because there are so many issues that farm workers are facing around climate change, and you talked about 3 of them, but if you had to prioritize, which issue would you prioritize when thinking about how we at Farmworker Justice or organizations working with farm workers across the country, how they can support farm workers as they are impacted by climate change?
So I would say that one of the most important issues affecting farm workers in that regard is that of emergency preparedness, because this involves not just those climate events that cause heat stress, but we are seeing so much more. We are seeing droughts, we're seeing wildfires, we're seeing floods. And it's not just farm worker organizations that can help farm worker communities, but other kinds of community organizations in which anyone really can get involved, whether that's from volunteering, providing financial support. There's a lot that needs to be done, and it traditionally has not had the level of support that it needs, but it's something that between us and the private sector and government, if we all do our part, we can really make a difference.
Thank you. We actually do have a question. In terms of regional differences, because there are differences, region to region in terms of the impact of climate change, wildfires in the West, hurricanes on the East Coast and Southeast, and so on and so forth. So how could states address these challenges for their specific regions?
Yes, that is a great question. Last year, a group of farm worker organizations, of which Farm Worker Justice was part, came together on the issue of wildfires. And we were recommending that Western states have harmonized standards for wildfire smoke protections for farm workers. And California, Washington, Oregon, they each have their different rules. And although they still have those differing rules in place, it was important for the farm worker organizations to come together and place these issues before the policymakers. And yes, as Erin says, each region of the country has its own particular risks when it comes to climate change impacts. But I think that one general recommendation that can be made is that policymakers need to convene community representatives of those underserved and most impacted communities. They know what the needs are and they know what the solutions should be. Those solutions need to come from the communities because, in Florida, it may be hurricanes. In California, it's wildfires. In other places, you have other different kinds of impacts. But what we're seeing in all these places is that often agencies seem unaware of remote communities that are being impacted, whose needs have not been addressed. But no one has reached out to them to find out, what needs to be done to ensure that they're safe. And this isn't something that can be done when the disaster is already here. This is an important part of emergency preparedness that needs to happen everywhere.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mayra. And with that, I think we can share the survey and finish up the webinar. And again, if you do have any remaining questions, feel free to contact any of us and we will be happy to respond. But Mayra or Nina, do you want to wrap up the webinar?
Yes, so we invite everyone to please click on that link that we just put in the chat and help us by filling out a short evaluation survey. This is only a couple of questions and it takes less than a minute to fill out, but it will help us improve future outreach and education activities. And we would like to thank everyone, including our interpreters, for being here with us today. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us. We're going to be sharing the slides, so you will have our contact information. And any questions that you have, be sure to send them to us. We'd love to be in contact with you. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today.